Okay, so দেখে নেওয়া যাক how does this training process actually work, okay? If you remember, ছোটবেলায় we used to solve some math riddles like this one, okay? So, can you solve it? Well, pause the video and give it a try, okay? Meanwhile, let me see what our good old friend ChatGPT has to say. So I basically asked the same question to ChatGPT and let us analyze the response, okay? So these are the given statements, okay? 2 plus 2 equals 6, 3 plus 3 equals 11 and 4 plus 4 equals 18. Then ChatGPT basically লিখেছে, based on these equations we can see that the sum of the numbers on the left side of the equation, basically these two numbers, okay, is multiplied by a factor and then increased by a certain value to get the result on the right side, right, which basically means this one, right? So what this basically means is this, okay? So for example, প্রথম স্টেটমেন্টটা যদি আপনি লক্ষ্য করেন 2 plus 2 equals 6, how did we get 6? We basically multiplied these two numbers, okay, 2 times 2, and then we basically added a 2 which equals to 6. And for the third statement, 3 plus 3 equals 11, how did we get 11? We basically multiplied the first two numbers 3 times 3, and then like the first one we added 2, okay, which produced 11, okay? And for the final one it's exactly the same, 4 times 4 plus 2 we get 18. So ChatGPT basically from the given statements it figured out a pattern, okay, and using that same pattern it solved the given problem, okay? So ChatGPT it basically applied the same pattern to our specific problem, right? So we wanted to know 6 plus 6 equals what? So basically like the given statements, 6 times 6 plus 2 we get what? 38, right? So back to the original problem, right? Basically amra ChatGPT ke what did we provide, right? We provided ChatGPT with these three statements, right? And from these three statements ChatGPT it basically figured out the solution to this particular statement, right? First question, a particular statement, are they mathematically accurate? They're not, right? But they do make sense. Why? Because they have what? A pattern, okay? And this is very similar to how language really work, right? So throughout all these parts in our course আমরা যতগুলো এক্সাম্পল দেখেছি, যতগুলো এক্সারসাইজ আমরা প্র্যাকটিস করেছি, for the most part they were very formal and structured, right? They had a grammatical structure, okay? But in reality oftentimes আমাদের language, আমাদের human language, they are more casual, right? Sometimes they are not grammatically correct, or sometimes they look like they don't make sense but they actually do, right? And that's a very human thing to do, right? So not only our transformer architecture, not only does it have to understand the context from any given sentence, it also has to respond in a human-like way, right? Doesn't matter how the sentence or the sequence is phrased. It can be very formal, it can be very casual. So our transformer, our model is trained on all different types of data, be it formal or casual, but it has to represent human-like interaction, okay? So focus on this particular problem, okay? We provide the model with inputs and outputs. We use these three statements to train our model, right? We give it inputs and the corresponding output, and from each of these statements our model, it basically figures out a pattern, and using that pattern it can figure out what the output to this particular input sequence will be, right? Isn't that what we really want? Our model, it should predict the output sequence from the given input sequence. And how does it know what to predict? It is trained on a pattern. So let us try to understand this pattern a bit more. A particular statement, right? We can write this as a function that takes as input the value 2 and produces the output 6, right? Similarly, the second statement, we can write it as a function that takes as input 3 and produces an output of 11. And similarly, the third statement takes as input 4 and produces what? 18, right? So where is this pattern? We can elaborate the functions like this, right? So if this is a function that takes as input 2, then we basically multiply the input value by itself, then we add what? 2. So 2 times 2 plus 2, we get what? 6. একইভাবে যদি আমাদের function it takes as input 3, then what's the pattern? We basically multiply the number with itself again like the previous one, and then we add what? 2 to get 11. And similarly, the third statement follows the same pattern. We multiply the number with itself and then we add a 2 to get what? 18, right? So if we apply the same pattern onto our problem statement, so basically a function, if it takes as input 6, following the same pattern, we get our desired output, which is basically what? 38, right? So what did we actually do, right? We provided our model, our transformer, our ChatGPT with the inputs and their corresponding outputs, right? So from this input and output, our model figures out what? The pattern, right? So this is basically what training is. We give it some samples, we give it data, we give it a set of input and output so that it can figure out the pattern, right? The relation between the input and output. And now the model, all it has to do is basically from the derived pattern and the given input sequence, it has to produce the output, right? So a particular technique যেখানে আমরা আমাদের মডেলকে we are providing it with the input and outputs at the same time, right, to train it, it is basically known as supervised learning, okay? And the concept is quite easy, right? All we have to do is we have to provide a bunch of input and their corresponding output so that the model can learn the pattern, okay? But in reality, models like GPT or ChatGPT, they are not trained in a supervised way. They are trained in an unsupervised way, right? And what do we mean by unsupervised? In case of unsupervised learning, we only train the model using the inputs, okay? We don't provide the output. We don't tell our model the explicit outputs, okay? We let the model figure out the outputs themselves, okay? And this is exactly how our GPT models are trained, okay? And speaking of GPT, what does it actually mean, okay? So GPT, G, it stands for generative, P for pre-trained, and finally we have T, which you already know, transformer, okay? So you already know what a transformer is and you have some idea about training, but what is this pre-training and what is this generative, right? এই particular concept গুলো বুঝতে হলে you have to understand three more terminologies, namely unsupervised pre-training, supervised fine-tuning, and finally reinforcement learning with human feedback. Okay, so let us try to understand these terminologies with the help of a simple analogy. Okay, so what is the purpose of training in the first place, right? It is to learn patterns, right? To learn patterns in our language, okay? To learn patterns so that our model, it can imitate us humans, right? So think about this for a second. How do we as humans, মানুষ হিসেবে কিভাবে আমরা, how do we recognize patterns, right? We have what we call neurons, okay? So what are these neurons? Okay, neurons বা nerve cells in our brain, they basically store information, they recognize patterns, okay? Think about this. যখন আপনি ছোট ছিলেন, you were in your schools or maybe colleges, you had to study many different subjects, right? So আপনি যখন স্কুলে কিংবা কলেজে ছিলেন, say you had to study physics, then maybe biology, then maybe mathematics, then chemistry, then maybe a little bit of English, and then maybe social science, right? Now যখন আপনি এই particular subjectগুলো পড়ছিলেন, right, maybe in your schools or colleges, one question, did you have any specific goal, right? What do I mean by goal? যখন আপনি এই particular subjectগুলো পড়ছিলেন, আপনি কি জানতেন যে আপনি in future you would become a doctor or maybe an engineer or maybe a physicist or maybe a chemist, right? You did not know that, right? At least I did not. আমি জানতাম না, okay? So up until my schools or college, I really had little to no idea what I would become in future. And look at the irony where I'm at today talking about GPT stuff, okay? So the point I'm trying to make is, when you were studying all of these subjects, did you have any specific goal or did you consume everything? Okay, it is the second one, right? Apni, you trained yourself on everything, on all of these subjects. And remember, what does this training mean? In case of supervised learning, আমরা দেখেছিলাম, আমরা আমাদের মডেলকে, we would provide them a bunch of input and their corresponding outputs, right? But in our case, we only provide our brain with all the inputs, but we don't really know what's the output, right? What we want to become, whether a doctor or engineer or something else, we don't really know, right? So this we called unsupervised, right? Or to be more specific, we are training ourselves on all of the data without having a specific goal. We don't really know what we want to become. We have to figure that out on the way, right? So this is unsupervised pre-training. What's the outcome of this particular technique? Well, now you have a good knowledge over all the different subjects, but problem ta holo, you are not an expert on any of these subjects, right? So basically you are now jack of all trades but master of none. Okay, now fast forward few years. Say now you are a grown up, okay? School college apni shesh kore felechen, now you have to pick a particular career path, okay? You have to fix a specific goal, right? So say you want to be a doctor or maybe an engineer. Whatever it is, you have to gain expertise on that particular topic. So what's the difference? Now you have a specific goal, right? Now you exactly know whatever input you take in, you always know what's the output going to be. This is exactly what we know as supervised, right? Or to be more specific, this is what we call supervised fine-tuning. Fine-tuning means to prepare yourself specifically for a particular topic. And then think about this, যখন আপনি আপনার university life when you are taking on a course or maybe doing some experimentation, আপনার professor, he can identify your mistakes, right? Whatever mistakes you do, your professor or your teacher, your supervisor, he has some feedback. He provides some feedback, and with the help of those feedback you can correct yourself, right? This is exactly what we know as RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback. Now, how does it all translate to GPT? Okay, so a quick reminder. What was the purpose of training the GPT, right? So that it could learn the patterns. এবং আমরা মানুষ, how do we learn patterns? আমরা বলেছিলাম, we have in our brains neurons or nerve cells that help us identify patterns in languages, right? So machine learning or deep learning models like GPT, to identify or recognize patterns in language, they use what we call parameters. এবং যখন আমরা ছোট ছিলাম, in our schools or colleges, we would study everything, right? All these subjects like biology, chemistry, English and all others, right? So in case of GPT, these particular subjects are nothing but NLP tasks, okay? So we have to train our GPT model on all of these NLP tasks, right? Q&A, then language generation, text classification, summarization, sentiment analysis, then translation, right? So initially we have to do what we know as unsupervised pre-training, where আমাদের GPT model, it does not gain expertise on a particular NLP task, but it tries to generalize its knowledge on any given NLP task, okay? Be it summarization, classification, sentiment analysis, কিংবা Q&A, right? It has to gain a general understanding. It has to identify the pattern for all the different tasks. It has to train on everything, okay? So the GPT-1 model, which was basically the first generation of GPT, it was trained on the books corpus dataset, which had some 7,000 unpublished books, which helped training the language model on unseen data. GPT-1, it had 117 million parameters to identify patterns. Then we have GPT-2, the second version of GPT, right, which was trained on the web text dataset, which basically had 40 gigabytes of text data from over 8 million documents. And GPT-2, it had 1.5 billion parameters, which is basically 10 times more than GPT-1. Then successor to GPT-2, আমরা পেয়েছি GPT-3, which was trained on a variety of datasets from Common Crawl, WebText 2, Books 1, Books 2 and Wikipedia articles, which totaled to a whopping 45 terabytes of text data. And can you imagine how many parameters GPT-3 might have? An astounding 175 billion parameters, which is 100 times more than its predecessor GPT-2. So now আমাদের GPT model, it is trained to generate human-like texts for any given NLP task, right? It has a very good general understanding, especially considering GPT-3, which has billions of parameters. But now, if you remember, after a certain time, we have to gain expertise on a particular domain, on a particular topic, right? So that's where we have supervised fine tuning, where our model has to gain expertise for specific downstream tasks, which may be, say, language translation, hote pare sentiment analysis, hote pare text summarization, or maybe text classification, language generation. Okay, Chat GPT, for example, which is based on GPT 3.5, it is fine-tuned on question answering, Q&A. Okay, it is very good at answering our questions. And not only that, we also provide human feedback to perform reinforcement learning, right? We rank the outputs produced by our models and we correct the outputs. আমরা আমাদের মডেলকে শিখিয়ে দেই with specific examples যে from all of these outputs you produced, this one was the best. We rank the output so the model, it can understand which output or prediction is best among all others. So there you go, যেটা আমরা বুঝলাম বা যেটা আমরা শিখলাম, আমাদের GPT models at the first stage of training, it has to generalize its knowledge. It has to have a good understanding of all the given tasks, be it question answering, language generation, summarization, or translation, right? You name it. Then, when it has a good general understanding, now we have to fine-tune the model with specific examples, right? So that's what supervised is. Amra oke dekhiye dei specific sets of input and output so that we can better fine-tune our model for a specific downstream task. We also provide human feedback to correct our model. ছোট একটা প্রশ্ন অনেক সময় আসে যে why don't we pre-train our model using supervised learning, right? Why do we let the model figure out the output or the patterns themselves? Okay, you see, models like GPT, they are called large language models, right? Because they're trained on vast or large amount of data ranging from gigabytes to even terabytes of data, okay, and providing specific inputs and outputs or labeled data for all the training examples খুবই কঠিন একটা কাজ, right? So what we do is, initially we take help of unsupervised pre-training, where we let the model figure out the pattern, and then when the model, it has a good grasp or a general understanding of all the different topics, we provide specific examples on a smaller dataset to fine-tune our model. Okay, so this combination of unsupervised pre-training followed by supervised fine-tuning, this is exactly what we mean when we say generative pre-training. Okay, so although our model, for example, say ChatGPT, it's very good at question answering purposes, right? But যদি আপনি নোটিস করে থাকেন, আমাদের ChatGPT, it is still very good at summarizing texts or translating texts or maybe classifying text or predicting something, okay? And there is a specific term which we often call zero-shot learning, right? Which basically means, although we provide examples when we fine-tune our models on a specific task, আমাদের model, it's still quite good at generalizing any given NLP task, right? Because of the vast amount of data that it was trained on. Oftentimes, যখন we instruct ChatGPT to perform a particular task, oftentimes we don't have to provide it with any examples at all, right? It still understands what we want. So this process where we don't have to provide explicit examples, but our model, it still understands the context, it still understands the instruction and generates human-like output. This is exactly what we know as zero-shot learning. We provide zero examples but still get a good enough output. And there you go. Now you know how GPT is able to produce human-like outputs, right? Because it was trained on a vast amount of human language from which it identified patterns, and it uses those patterns to produce amazing outputs. And is GPT the only model that does so? So if you visit this particular website, livearchitect.ai, they present a beautiful comparison of all the different large language models in terms of their parameter size. Okay, for example, here we have Megatron Turing NLG model, which has a gigantic 530 billion parameters. We have Palm model, then BERT model and Lambda by Google. We also have the Blue model by Big Science, and not to mention our very own GPT-3 having 175 billion parameters, with its predecessors GPT-2 and GPT-1, which were all developed by OpenAI. LiveArchitect.ai, they have this amazing spreadsheet where they pretty much list down all the available large language models, or LLM, similar to GPT. At the very top we can see GPT-5 by OpenAI. It's not yet released, so the parameters are yet to be announced. It is immediately followed by Gemini from Google DeepMind. So আমি যদি basically if I press Ctrl F and if I type GPT, so at the very top we have 5 obviously. So we also have GPT-4. Okay, so GPT-4, it's somewhere, okay, there it is. So GPT-4, as you can see, it has 1000 billion parameters. Okay, basically a trillion parameters. Now if we search for, say, ChatGPT, there you have it. ChatGPT, it has 175 billion parameters. Okay, then if we search for, say, our GPT-3, there it is, GPT-3 by OpenAI. We already saw it. It has a parameter of 175 billion. And not very far away we have GPT-2 and GPT-1, right? If you see, we also have these models like BERT from Google. We also had this MTNLG, যেটা আমরা ছবিতে একটু আগে দেখে এসেছি, which was developed by Microsoft and Nvidia. It has a parameter of 530 billion. There are other models from Google like BERT 480 and 200, representing their number of parameters. We have Palm, also from Google, Lambda from Google, then we have Bloom by Big Science, and so on. Okay, you can also get information on different datasets for these models. Also, it has a sheet on ChatGPT achievements and many more. Okay, it's an interesting spreadsheet. You can visit it anytime you want. So we are almost at the end of the first part of our course, and I really want to discuss the key takeaways of what we have learned so far from all of these discussions. Okay, so before that I want to show you something. এটা হলো আমাদের word embedding projector by TensorFlow. Okay, so basically what you see in the screen is basically a 3D representation of our word embedding vectors. Okay, all of these points in this particular 3D representations are different words, right? So no matter where I hover on this particular 3D representation, all of these words are basically dense vectors, and the words sharing similar context, they are always closer together. Okay, so let me search for a particular word. Okay, say river. So where is our river on this word embedding projector? And there it is, right? So let me get closer to our word river. Now what are the words that share context with river, right? So which words are closer to this particular word river? Okay, so if we hover around this particular word river, we can see Falkland. Okay, then we can see words like shores. We can also see coast. Okay, then we can also see Bengal. And do you know what's interesting? Do you recognize this word? It is none other than Bangladesh, right? Can you guess why Bangladesh is closer to river? আমরা সবাই জানি বাংলাদেশ একটি নদীমাতৃক দেশ, right? So it shares context with river. So if you want to understand word embeddings in a visual manner, I highly recommend to visit this particular site, okay, and play around with the word embeddings. Okay, so gradually we are moving towards the heart of our course, which is prompt engineering, right? So when we will design prompts, we have to keep this one thing in mind, right? That words matter. Okay, আমরা দেখে এসেছি how does it understand context from the given input sequence, which is basically what? The prompt, right? And then how it is trained on human-like texts language so that it can produce or predict what to really answer. So our job is basically to specify the appropriate context. Okay, so we always have to target the specific region. যখনই আমরা চাই আমাদের output word, whenever we want a particular output, we always have to focus onto the words that are around that output word. Okay, for example, if we want our output to be river, then we always have to pick the words that are nearby river. Okay, if we say prompt ChatGPT with a word that is far away from the desired word, then it might not understand the context, right? So you always have to target the desired region. If you want as output a particular word, you always have to focus on the words around it. Okay, and there is actually a beautiful quote on this, which is, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps."